Okay, thanks to everybody for being back on time. We're going to go ahead and get started. And we'll begin with a voting session, and I'm going to ask Matt to take us through the technology and the voting process.
Yeah, so I think everybody on the CTAF panel has made it onto the right network. And then for those of you who happened to step out about 10 minutes ago, if you're a member of the audience and you're on the Nile network, if you wouldn't mind switching to either GIN large or GIN small, the password is the same as the one listed up here, but it should make sure that the panel's voting goes pretty smoothly. And if you need the password, there's a sheet in the front room that has it listed on it. I'm going to move ahead in the slides, though. So we have our usual test question, just to make sure everything is working for the panel. So in honor of the recently ended Olympics, I wanted to see what people's favorite Olympic sport was. I've also followed the time-honored ICER tradition of lumping and splitting, so there's a lot of different ways to skate, a lot of different skiing disciplines. We're just talking about big buckets here.
Matt, could you just remind us, how do we get to this place?
You don't have to worry about that.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, you can vote on the question, though, if you'd like. All right. So we've got 9 responses so far. We're looking for 13. Is anybody having trouble with their technology? 12. Looking good. Looking for one more response. So as soon as you select the button, either on your remote or in the web browser on your cell phone, it should cast your vote. There we go. Perfect. All right. Curling. A lot of curling fans. Excellent, guys. And a surprise gold for the American team, so I understand the spirit. So this is great. All right. So that was it.
All right.
That's a conspiracy.
Okay, that is clearly the high point of the voting for the rest of the afternoon. Now, how many of you would have voted curling before we won the gold medal in it? That's my real question. Probably a little bit of bias there. All right. So what we do now in the next phase is we, in a sense, go back to the beginning, and we think hard, again, about the evidence, and this is an opportunity for the panel to revisit the evidence on both effectiveness and value in different ways. We have the patient representatives and the clinical experts at the table still, along with the economic and the effectiveness research leads. So what I'm going to do is read the voting questions, and then we'll have a discussion about the evidence and perspectives from the panel. So we're starting with the first patient population, which will be the same for the questions, for the first 4 questions. It's for patients ages 0 to 25 years with B-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia that is refractory or in second or greater relapse. The question is the evidence adequate to demonstrate a net health benefit for treatment with Kymriah versus treatment with clofarabine or comparable immunotherapy or chemotherapy, e.g. blinatumomab or multi-agent chemotherapy, including clofarabine? The options are yes or no. So let me ask the panel again. You can either just kind of catch my eye, or if you want to use your name tent cards as you think about this. Let me first invite Jeff to just really briefly summarize the findings in the ICER review. I will also encourage you to look at your evidence summaries that have the key tables from the report. And why don't we start then with Jeff, and then we'll take it from there.
Hopefully this is on. So I would say, just while you're looking at the tables, I would say the key tables are 3.3. So 3.3 is the overall remission rates that take into account what I would call an intent to treat analysis, and actually the authors did in the New England Journal article. So it takes into account the people who had leukapheresis, so we intended to give CAR T therapy, but they never received it. So the actual response rate goes down. It's not the 81% that was highlighted in the pivotal trial, but much lower, down to 66% in that trial. But the range in the overall remission rates is between 57 and 73% compared to 20 to 63% with the comparators. But even more important is table 3.4, where you're looking at the event-free and overall survival. Overall survival at 12 months ranged from 62 to 81% for Kymriah versus 20 to 38% for the comparator. So you're talking, anywhere from a 40 to 60% absolute difference in total mortality at 1 year. So that's the big benefit. The harms, we've included, I guess, table D7, where you see harms pulled from the trials of Kymriah versus the harms reported in the clofarabine trial, so you get some sense of the differences there. So I think that's where you should focus in deciding the net health benefits of Kymriah versus the comparator therapy.
Okay. Questions from the panel? Joy.
Jeff, could you give us an idea of, for particularly the 12-month survival, how many patients actually contributed to those percentages?
Well, let's see. I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers directly. I mean, remember, each of these trials in the pediatric population are, less than 100 starting. The percentage who actually contributed.
Were actually followed out to 12 months.
Right, so those who died or who were still alive and still being followed, I don't have those numbers at my fingertips. The median survival in the Eliana trial, the pivotal trial, was about 15 months, so more than 50% were followed that far, but 50% of 90-some, or of 75 patients, I guess, who received therapy, 80, yeah.
Joy, your question, so sorry, Jeff, if you don't know the answer and we don't have it at our fingertips, is someone from Novartis able to answer the question about the number of patients? If not, no worries, but can you, sorry, I'll repeat it, that's okay. What?
My name is Vadim Romanov. I'm Executive Medical Director with Novartis CAR-T Group. So 75 patients, median overall survival 19.2 months. It's figure 2B in New England Journal of Medicine.
But yeah, the question is that, in this, the overall survival figure of 62% in that, how many actually, what percentage of the 75 actually contributed to that? In other words, who had either failed therapy, died at that point, or had at least a year worth of follow-up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Obviously, the issue that was discussed a lot this morning was the issue of uncertainty around the longer-term data. This question, in many ways, will weave in your considerations around uncertainty, but you may have other issues to raise as well, or questions for Jeff, the clinical experts, or the patients. Yes. Oh, I thought you were having another question. Oh, go ahead,
Just
Paul.
a minor point. It's stated as an or. Is the evidence that is the benefit better this or that? I mean, it's sort of
Right,
we're
so-
thinking and, or is it better
The
than
idea
both?
was,
Either is it.
I think we're phrasing this. Is the evidence adequate to say that it's actually
Because if you
that the net health benefit is better than any of those? So not any one, but each of them. It's better than clofarabine.
Right, it was equivalent to like the
Blinatumomab, Blincyto. Yeah.
But better than clofarabine, and you could still say yes. And say a yes to that then. Anyway, that's,
I think it's intended to be really better, net health benefit is better than each of these.
better than both. Yeah,
Yes.
all the, yes, okay.
Either or. Clinical experts, you sometimes get asked a question along these lines, but when we ask people about a net health benefit, that's obviously thinking about both positives and negatives, risk effects as well. What evidence do you think the panel should focus on the most in its interpretation to help them answer this question?
So from the Pediatrics Perspective in children with leukemia, I think that the most important thing was brought up by one of the advocates earlier, in that it's what long-term cure is. These are heavily pretreated patients who are willing to put up with a fair amount. I think it's important to appreciate that for most patients in this category, the side effects of Chimera are less than the side effects of the things that they've gone through, and the hospitalization time is actually much shorter than all of the other alternatives.
Good. Jeff?
Did you want to?
No, I think you can add to that.
Jeff?
So I had a question for the experts too.
Sure.
I've got this rash. No. There are some people who will say that cohort studies are not the strongest design. There are other people who think randomized clinical trials or randomized control trials are the way to go because they feel there might be less bias. In your clinical experience, do you feel that there could be another reason besides the treatment that is giving us the results that we're seeing? If we did an RCT, would it completely destroy the advantages that some purport to show?
Speaking for the pediatric experience, it's actually very interesting. Unlike adult oncology, 9 out of 10 kids are actually on a national clinical trial who have cancer. And so that's the world we live in. A randomized controlled trial is always the optimum, but for any new therapy, you need to start with the phase 1-2 before, to ensure safety, and then to show at least non-inferiority before we would move to phase 3. So I can tell you that the Children's Oncology Group which manages most of these trials in North America, is discussing how we should, and which patients we should use for an RCT down the road now that we have these data. But this is just the necessary way to do things.
So you do feel an RCT is necessary?
Ultimately, you would like that, but I think from my perspective as a clinician, I don't like going to funerals. I like curing kids, and I work at a center that does phase 1 and phase 2 therapies that are offered for patients who have no other resorts and would otherwise die.
So let me take the privilege of the prerogative.
I was going to
go ahead.
Second that. I think that if you look at the population that was treated in the Zuma 1 study, and if you look at my view, again, somebody who would only see patients in the adult spectrum, and fortunately we see relatively few patients who are in their early 20s relative to other diseases like myeloid malignancy that we transplant more often. These are therapies that, although there were not RCTs, were highly selected groups of patients who would have had really pretty tragic outcomes or universally dismal prognosis. So I think for me, even though yes, ideally you would have done this, these studies were designed for maximal efficiency and to, I think, prove the point, and the bar was relatively low with respect to outcomes in these patients. So it doesn't seem to me to be a problem that there was no RCT that demonstrated results in these two categories. And I think that if you look at the quality of the peer-reviewed publications and the excitement in the field, that's justified by the fact that there is the limitation that these aren't RCTs for good reason, that the bar was low and that the outcomes were exceptional relative to what would have been expected. So it's not to say that we shouldn't have further confirmation, especially as we think about a slippery slope of broadening indications. I think that's the one thing. But if you look at the narrow indications and the guidelines under which these trials were done, I think that all of us are pretty impressed.
Can I just press that point home, because I know it will be part of the thinking of the panel, and it is the historical concern about, autologous bone marrow transplant for breast cancer, getting ahead of, with the hype, with the desperate need for some treatment for patients whose prognosis is so dismal, and the lack of randomized trials steering people in the wrong direction, at least for some amount of time. So what I heard you say was you feel that this patient cohort was selected in a way that selection bias could not have kind of cherry-picked patients who were going to have some great response, and that in some way you really think that the prognosis for these patients was consistent enough that the increase in remission seen with Kymriah is a true finding. So I'm kind of paraphrasing it in a negative way, but letting you respond in that sense.
In that direction, this was most definitely, at least in my mind, a game changer from the standpoint of a pediatric oncologist who sees kids with relapsed and refractory disease. Before we had this, for this select patient population who had been heavily pretreated, had generally had a transplant, the outcomes when the leukemia comes back are dismal, at less than 10%. And seeing this many kids in this population from the pediatric oncology perspective has been very, very impressive. If anything, I think we probably hedge against taking very, very high-risk patients with a lot of comorbidities simply because there's no other options for those patients. And the fact that that population of kids did well was truly remarkable.
Okay, thank you.
I would generally agree, but I wouldn't go quite as far as what you just stated, saying that we know that there was no, for example, selection bias. There always is. So I would take away the caveat that I think you made some statements that are a little broader than my endorsement, but I think that, to me, these are highly refractory patients. For example, looking at the diffuse large B-cell lymphoma patients treated in trials to date. And if you look, again, unfortunately, we have imperfect comparison data sets, including SCHOLAR-1, but I think clearly reflect historically very poor outcomes with respect to complete response rates and overall response rates and longevity of outcomes. And although the data are, not as mature as we would love to see, there was such dramatic, I think, improvements in both overall response rates and complete response rates that I think the word game changer is appropriate. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that we don't know that, there always is naturally selection bias. Patients who come to an academic medical center are different than the people who might live in the same zip code and not get to that clinical trial because they have a different level of socioeconomic background or understanding and ability to tolerate therapies, for example, and have the clinical support that's needed. So those are natural limitations of any trial, but I think that's also a reflection of the comparison groups, for which I think, we and others assessed these responses, which are remarkable.
I think what Steve is trying to get at, though, is are the differences in the patient characteristics, for instance, in the trial of blinatumomab compared to the patients who were enrolled in the Kymriah trials, sufficient to explain the magnitude of the difference? Do you think that, or is the absolute difference in outcomes, remission rate, complete remission rates, and survival large enough that there's no way that the the differences in patient ages and stuff could explain, differences in these outcomes?
I think it's easier to compare clofarabine and Kymriah because those patients, if you look in the tables, are more similar. There's more difference between the blinatumomab and the Kymriah patients.
Okay, we have a little bit more time for discussion on this point before the vote. Joy?
So I just want to express a little more clearly what my concern is. So this is the New England Journal paper with the 75 patients that was published last month. So it starts out with 75 patients, but when I look at the survival curve, overall survival, and I go out to 18 months since infusion, and I see the number at risk, so that's the number that made it that far, either because they started later or because they've already died, right? So at that point, at 18 months, there are 8 patients at risk. So that seems like a very small number, and when I think about the expert comment about the importance of long-term cure, I am anxious about how much we actually know to be able to answer that question at this point.
Okay. I will point out that the question obviously talks about a net health benefit, and the degree to which it being a cure is an important component in your judgment of that. I'm sure it's part of it, but I just want to highlight that we're not asking whether the evidence is adequate to say it's a cure or not.
Right, but there's no time frame around the
That's correct.
around the question.
That's correct.
So it could be net health benefit at 1 month or at 18 months, and there's a different evidence base.
That's absolutely true. Okay. Quickly in advance of the vote, I would like to invite anybody who's prepared to vote yes to state briefly why they think that their vote is going to be yes. Anybody? Well, we'll start on the no side. Anybody who's preparing to vote no on this question, would they like to share their reasoning with the rest of the panel before the vote? Oh dear. We don't have uncertain as an option, I'm sorry, so everybody's going to have to vote. Jeff?
Perhaps we could change the question to, could someone think of a reason why someone, maybe you, but maybe not you, could
vote
say
yes.
that this wasn't adequate?
Sure.
Like I might have a skeptical friend.
Sure.
And she...
With a rash,
she might
yes,
not be
with a rash, yes.
enamored with single-arm cohort studies. Hypothetically, this friend of mine, and she might not think that's adequate to demonstrate, especially if the selection bias was large enough, or if there were certain things that maybe are important to patients but weren't captured in the trial or weren't captured for long enough. It's possible this skeptical friend of mine might say, this is not adequate enough.
Right, okay. People want to take on either a hypothetical or their own position. Again, this is helpful for stakeholders and for the public to understand the issues that you're wrestling with when you come to an ultimate judgment in this vote. Anybody else? Felicia?
I think what I'm struggling with is that definition of adequacy. And in the context of desperately ill children, I can't help but wonder if we have a sliding scale definition that may change with the context. And that's, as an ethicist, that's what I struggle with routinely, but in the context of children, it's always harder.
Okay. Bob?
I think in the context of heavily pretreated patients.
So there were two Bobs. Go ahead. We can't.
I think in the context of heavily pretreated patients, some of whom had a very high burden of disease, these responses are impressive. So, adequate for me.
Yeah, both of the Bobs have some fairly similar issues here that I think are going to come up with in the round table here, which to me is a little more germane. I'm not happy with the way we got to this particular point on any number of mechanics that are involved in it. However, we do have the evidence that we do have. I do think it is adequate, clearly. And, you know, I'll at least speak to the elephant in the room. I'm not going to be the one to say no to these kids. And I've been too close to pediatric oncology for too many years to know that's kind of just not what you do. You know, and I've never seen really anybody that's very comfortable with dealing with this situation, but the answer is fairly obvious when you get to this point with it.
Pat?
Well, I don't think any of us wants to couch this as saying no to these kids. And I look at it as the quality of the information that we have before us and this question, and that's separate from will these children have access to this therapy? Because 9 out of 10 of them are in a trial, and that's the norm for this population. So I don't think we should conflate access with the value question.
Okay, I am sensitive to the time, and we've got other benefits and other issues to vote on. So let's go ahead and open up the voting. I see some of you have already begun to vote. So when we get to 13, we will be able to show the results. There we go. 10 yes and 3 no. All right, let's keep going. I think we had a good discussion prior to the vote, so we don't need to debrief it further at this point. All right, so if you remember, the conceptual framework for the ICER value assessment includes talking about other potential benefits and disadvantages, and we've chosen to frame these as benefits, potential benefits, but it's going to be open to the panel to also highlight where there could be potential disadvantages that need to be considered in thinking about value. So just real quickly, I'll read the kind of the choice set here. The first is that, does this treatment offer potentially a reduced complexity that will significantly improve outcomes? Now, this is a shorthand version of a longer question that the panel has in front of them. It's just we can't project it. So again, it's right, reduced complexity that will significantly improve patient outcomes. The next one is the intervention will reduce important health disparities across racial, ethnic, gender, socioeconomic, or regional categories. The next one is that it will significantly reduce caregiver or broader family burden. The next one is that it offers a novel mechanism of action or approach that will allow successful treatment of many patients who have failed other available treatments. And the last is that this intervention will have a significant impact on improving patients' ability to return to work and/or their overall productivity, or any other significant other benefit or disadvantage that you guys see. So I'll ask the panel again to think about this, to hold off on your votes until, if you can, until you hear some of the discussion from your peers. Does anybody want to ask questions, either of the patient representatives or clinical experts, or of each other, to help inform your voting on whether there's a significant other benefit in any of these categories? Alex.
I'd be interested in hearing from the clinical experts or anyone else what the potential is for the decision, which I think is probably the right decision given the concerns about side effects, to restrict use of these medications to specialized centers and a select number of specialized centers. How will that impact existing disparities, both by all of these metrics, in particular racial and ethnic disparities, which have been shown to be pervasive and rather profound?
So I'll tack it first. I think it's critical, and I think when you look at specialized programs, and again, states and other regulatory agencies have approached this with, in some cases, certificate of need requirements. We, as a professional society, have thought a lot about this because hematopoietic transplantation in many ways, of course, was a cellular therapy that we've been doing now for more than 60 years and has advanced in most cases prior to regulation by the FDA and other organizations, but in a highly successful way that's allowed successively older patients, successively more comorbid patients, successively more diverse patients, and yet with improving outcomes. So how have we achieved that? I think that there are really three parts of that. One is to advance clinical science and basic science through professional societies and academic institutions. The second part of that is regulation, and the ASBMT and the International Society for Cellular Therapy co-founded FACT, which is a foundation for the accreditation of cell therapy, which is voluntary accreditation. There is now a 7th edition of hematopoietic and cell therapy standards, and that is really regulation by and for the people, as opposed to external regulation by an organization. And then the third thing is really transparent data reporting. In the case of hematopoietic transplantation, and we think now in cellular therapy, the Center for International Blood and Marrow Transplant Research has facilitated transparent outcomes data reporting, which is both risk and disease severity associated. And for hematopoietic transplantation, in fact, we have a federal mandate. We have the Stem Cell Therapeutics Outcomes Database. So those things that are done, and remember, we have not pushed payers to say we must or you must force FACT accreditation. The federal government has, through the C.W. Bill Young Act, said that there needs to be federal reporting of allogeneic transplant data, but not autologous transplant data. But we can point to that framework as being one that payers have often used as their basis for inclusion in centers of excellence networks. And I would say we are agnostic toward this. We would not say that this must be the way it's done, but that this has advanced safety and improved access, and it does not now allow individuals to kind of pretend through marketing or false communication or false hope, or we're the closest center to you and we're just as good. I think it creates more issues with access and assurance of quality than it does create barriers. So I think that your point is an important one. We have to look now, especially since there are a relatively small number of centers. But I think given the fact that we're talking about, when we're talking about neurotoxicity, we're talking about 30 to 40% of patients who can't speak, right? We're not talking about trivial toxicities. And these are things that require handling of a cell product, highly specialized care, highly specialized medications. And to me, we have to be mindful of those issues. As professional societies, of course, it's critical that we reach the patients who need them, regardless of racial background or socioeconomic status. But I think that to me, these needs and these requirements, as long as we impose frameworks that ensure quality and transparency of I think success of those outcomes, I think will outweigh the potential bottlenecks. We have to be mindful of those bottlenecks and make sure that the harm is not exceeding the benefits. But to me, this is critical, and it's probably better than some external regulation can achieve.
Okay, thank you. We'll need to keep, right. If you can frame your answers briefly.
I would agree
that'll
with
help you.
all
Thank
of
you.
that, and I would just say that the only thing I think important to be aware of and to add is that at least in the state of California, I mean, all of the patients we've treated, if they had different insurance providers, including Medi-Cal and CCS kids, and that has actually been very supported. And so I think there's not going to be as many barriers as I had initially worried about.
Okay, thank you. I did want to invite either of the patients, if the other benefits often try to speak to things that patients think of as very important that might be harder to capture or impossible really to capture in the cost effectiveness or in the early clinical trials. Any comments about where you see particular significant benefits of Kymriah versus other available treatments at this time?
I think what I would like to say, where it says, significantly reduce caregiver and family burden, when I think this therapy, the way I see it, I wish that it could become eventually like frontline treatment. The effects and the side effects that my son has, from all of the toxic therapies that he has had thus far, we have to live with, the rest of his life. So I would say this treatment was definitely, safer. He didn't experience a lot of the side effects and bad toxicities that he did with all of his other chemotherapies and total body irradiation and cranial radiation and the stuff that we're going to be seeing effects from, for the rest of his life.
Okay, thanks. Emily, anything to add?
I would add to that and second everything she said, but just the having had a stem cell transplant myself and then all the other chemos involved before doing CAR T, the side effects that I experienced, and I experienced all the ones that were listed as possible side effects, were far less challenging and difficult than all the things I had done before with chemo and stem cell transplant. So I think that's important to consider, that this is, yes, it's serious and comes with its risks and challenges, but it is far easier on a patient in my experience and from what I've heard from other patients.
Okay, thank you.
And just to add for point E up there from the clinical perspective, post-transplant, most patients are cleared to go back to school or back to work for 6 to 9 months. And, on average, our patients are being cleared to go back to all of those things around 6 to 8 weeks. So that's very different.
Okay. I want to make, just so the panel knows, again, this is to be compared to the treatments that we talked about. So this is not versus a stem cell transplant specifically. It's versus the other treatments, clofarabine and blinatumomab, et cetera. Sorry, Kim, yes, one more.
I was going to say and add to, so my son did do clofarabine on first first relapse and also when he relapsed after transplant. And we were told, that all would have to be done inpatient. He'd have to be inpatient for about 4 weeks, just because of the risk for infections and all, he had been heavily pretreated. When we did CAR T therapy, we did it as an outpatient basis, which that's how they do it, obviously, for pediatrics. And we were able to be on an outpatient basis, and he was relatively well and was able to, see the sights of Philly and do some fun things. And after the 4 weeks of when we found out that the treatment had worked, he went back to school, back to kindergarten, that week. So I'm sure, I don't know, you were able to go back to...
I was at a concert 2 weeks after my clinical trial.
Hope it was a good one.
So
All
compared
right,
to
that's
when,
good. Yes.
transplant, we were,
Yeah.
in mandatory isolation for, 6 months to a year and couldn't enjoy anything.
Okay.
It is important to point out in the pediatric setting that if you get clofarabine, that's only as a bridge to get you to transplant. You're not going to ever stop with just that therapy.
Okay, thanks. Okay, if anybody would like to raise an issue about their votes ahead of the voting, I think we're probably close to having the information and perspectives that you would like. Okay, why don't we go ahead and vote? Again, what you do is you use, you can select as many of these, so it's not a select one, select as many as you would like. I'm going to give everybody about 30 seconds, and then I'll ask if you're completed, because we can't use the responses this way to know when everybody's finished voting. We need match game music or something in the back. Okay, I'm seeing most people look like they're completed, but I think we have at least one person still voting, so we'll wait on. Is anybody still voting? Okay, here are the results then. 1 for A, as you can see, 0 for B, 3 for C. 13 out of 13 said a novel mechanism of action or approach. 10 said significant impact on return to work or overall productivity. And we have 3 other. Now that's interesting. So since we didn't identify an other, just again for transparency, we should at least try to quickly capture if there were specific other. I hope that wasn't just a voting error in your system. But did people intend to vote other? Did anybody try to vote other? Oh dear. Matt, how is it set up on your, is it 1, 2, 3? Do you guys have numbers or do you have letters? You have letters. So I wonder how it could have shown 3 for F. Nobody voted F? Is it because we had a different voting set? Okay.
Steve?
We're going to have to re-vote. And what you're going to have to do is to look just up here on your slide and not at any older material for the votes that you should take. So to do that, do I have to click the green circular? I got it. Okay, we're going to re-poll this question. So you've got 5 choices, A, B, C, D, or E, and assuming there isn't an other, those are your choices, A, B, C, D, or E, as stated up there. Sorry about that, everybody, so let's go ahead and re-vote. Anybody still voting? Okay, I'll wait. Good? Okay. All right. So Nobody voted A. Nobody voted B. How do we have 14 responses?
13 plus.
Yeah, this is tricky, because this is supposed to help with transparency. Okay. What we're going to do is to assume that this is the p-value on these numbers is probably less than 0.05, but there's a small chance that by chance we got some of this. So we're going to confirm with the panel afterwards, and when the votes are reported out in the final results, we will have a confirmed voting from the panel, given the questions related to the distribution here. Let's move ahead, though, to the contextual issues. It's the same voting scheme, but here we're talking about not other benefits, but broader contextual issues in some ways. So let me just read them out again in full. A is that this intervention, where is it? Is intended for the care of individuals with a condition of particularly high severity in terms of impact on length of life and or quality of life. B is that the intervention is intended for the care of individuals with a condition that represents a particularly high lifetime burden of illness. C is that it is the first to offer any improvement for patients with this condition. D, compared to clofarabine or comparable chemo or immunotherapy, there is a significant uncertainty about the long-term risk of serious side effects. E, compared again to clofarabine or comparable immuno or chemotherapy, is there significant uncertainty about the magnitude or durability of the long-term benefits of this intervention? And then F, if you guys would like to suggest whether there is another important contextual issue that should be considered by those who are making an overall judgment of value. Okay, I know you, yes, Rena.
This may be just semantics, but I'm really having a hard time answering this question because of the compared to in D and E, and because of the phrase high lifetime burden of illness in B, which I think these would be great for maybe a different drug that we were talking about. The difficulty I'm having with B is if we're assuming that without treatment, there's no survival, it's hard to assess lifetime burden of illness without, okay. So if high lifetime burden of illness is the same thing as not surviving, then I can answer it.
Right. I can tell you that factor is built in from, you're right, consideration of the treatments for other conditions that do have decades-long effects on people's lives. So traditionally, very shortly terminal conditions are not considered to have a high lifetime burden of illness.
Yeah. But you don't have a high lifetime, so.
Right.
You don't get a high lifetime burden. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
But you get A.
What's that?
But you get A.
Yeah. D and E, I would like to answer without having to compare. In other words, again, it's the same issue for me. Compared to other treatment, again, if you're talking about the likelihood of survival being so low. So yes, I think there's uncertainty about long-term risks, long-term benefits, magnitude, durability, but there's less uncertainty compared to, we have certainty about the alternatives.
Understood. So that's why they're meant to provide some context, and that they don't always apply to every situation. So this is just, again, if you think there are particular aspects that kind of jump out about this comparison or this new treatment that are important, in a way that haven't come up before or that should really kind of envelop the consideration about the evidence, this is the opportunity to identify that. Sorry, Alex, yes.
So I'd like to propose some additional considerations that were raised by one of the earlier person who called in on the phone, David Mitchell, I think was his name. The first is that should we be considering take into account the fact that these medications were developed with significant investment of taxpayer resources? Should that impact the long-term, our impression of the long-term value for the money? And how much profit is enough for these drug companies in view that these medications, again, were developed with considerable taxpayer resources?
Tell you what, I'm going to take that as or maybe I'll return that with a friendly amendment, which is those will definitely be, as I mentioned, discussed in the policy roundtable and wrapped into the policy insights and recommendations that will come out as part of the final meeting. I think in many ways, in doing so, we will raise the question of whether those are important contextual issues in thinking about value or not. But I'm going to suggest we don't try to list them now and not vote on them. I think they deserve the discussion that we'll have in the policy roundtable in some ways. Other thoughts about or questions about these before you think you're preparing to vote? Okay, why don't we go ahead and vote then? Again, select all that apply. Like a teacher, when you're done, put your pencils down so I can see it. Good. Everybody done? Anybody still working? Still working. No, sorry. Everybody's done. Okay.
I'm not done.
No, we're still working. Sorry, Pat. Okay. Let's see if we get a 14 this time. Aha, okay. 12A, you can see this too, obviously. 1 for B, 5 for C, 9 for D and E, and 4 for F. Now, was F with Alex's specific? Did anybody vote F? Kim?
Well, I voted F for other considerations in that I think long-term reproductive risks need to be considered. We've briefly talked about mutagenesis, but I think that that's real. And then what happens with the persistent memory T cells, we don't really know much about that yet. So I think there's more to learn.
Okay. I would probably suggest, did you probably voted yes on the uncertainty? Significant uncertainty on D as well?
Yes.
I think conceptually that would fit within that level of uncertainty about long-term risks that I think we could probably capture it there. Were there 3 other people who intended to vote others? Okay, Paul.
Yeah, mine was the issue of potential for cure above and beyond, say, the life years gained, that there's something special, sort of like the rule of rescue. There's something special about potentially able to cure someone of a condition.
Okay. Don't worry, we will capture these. I was just kind of making a process statement that I think yours would fit within D2. So the contextual issue of this offering a possible cure. Did 2 other people have an other benefit that they had intended to vote for? All right, looks like we'll have to do another kind of confirmation of votes, unfortunately, following the meeting. Okay? So let's move on to the next patient set. Some of the issues will be the same, obviously, so we may be able to go a little bit quicker in some ways, but different drug, different patient population, so let's take the time that we need. I'm sorry, first we have to do the overall value vote on Kimrai. Apologies, we're not shifting to a different population yet. So now, remembering the conceptual framework where we've got comparative clinical effectiveness, incremental cost effectiveness, other benefits or disadvantages, and the contextual considerations. Your task is to integrate those in a way that will lead you to a summary vote on long-term value for money of either low, intermediate, or high. So the question says, given the available evidence on these 4 elements, What is the long-term value for money of treatment with Kymriah versus treatment with clofarabine? Low, intermediate, or high? So there's lots of quantitative factors around this that we've talked about, and there's lots of qualitative weighing and considering both of the other benefits and the contextual issues. I guess here, though, I can just invite Mel again just to very briefly summarize the cost-effectiveness findings.
So in this cohort, when we compared Kymriah to clofarabine, our base case estimate for cost effectiveness was around $46,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. Commonly cited value-based benchmarks are either $50,000 to $150,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. When we varied these inputs across a plausible range in the sensitivity analysis, none went above $100,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. When we looked at an alternate survival assumption to serve as a lower bound, the estimate was still around $80,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. And then looking at how far this, the evidence we're seeing in the trial would have to extend, it was around 7 years.
Questions from the panel? Thoughts on how you're going to be putting this all together that you can share with others as we deliberate on this? I'd love to hear somebody who's wrestling with how they're going to factor in the uncertainty piece with the findings that Mel just presented, for instance. Anybody have a way that they're thinking of putting those together that they'd like to share? Mike.
I don't have an uncertainty piece.
Sorry, just make sure you use the microphone.
I'm sorry. I don't have an uncertainty piece. These are kids that have no alternative.
Paul?
Yeah, and again, I agree, no alternative, but the question also is how should they be priced? And is this, at the current price, how should the cost, so you can think of it two ways, whether you're denying care or whether you're paying the appropriate amount.
I totally agree with that, but Melanie, to your definition of cost effectiveness or comparative effectiveness, it's about efficacy, not price, right?
And I would kind of caution of what cost effectiveness can say and what it can't. And so we are finding this value is below certain cost effective threshold, which means we're typically willing to pay $50,000 for one quality adjusted life year in return. It doesn't speak to the affordability factor. I wasn't involved in the budget impact analysis for this project. Other people in this room were. But that gets more into, can the markets, take on this price?
Joy?
So I struggle with being able to vote about this at all because I think the uncertainty is very large. And it really distresses me to hear people talk about these votes as being about whether we are denying access to this treatment for children, because I don't see these questions as being about that. And I hope that they're not about that. I really think they're about looking critically at whether we have enough evidence to say it's adequate, and the uncertainty is, low enough that we can make a determination that this cost-effectiveness ratio is meaningful. And I can't get there, so I can't vote.
Right. I mean, I would emphasize again that insofar as we have a policy roundtable at which we will talk about translating evidence, the findings and your judgments and others into actual coverage, pricing, and other kinds of policies, you shouldn't feel that your decision here is somehow directly indicating what that application should be. So we cover plenty of things in our healthcare system that are low value in some ways, right? We may not do some things that are high value. We want to wrestle with that, but I would encourage you not to think of them as kind of linked at the hip, if you will.
Yeah, well, I hope they're not, but yeah. But I feel like I can't answer this question given the information that I've got. I don't know what the value is.
Okay. Felicia and then Paul?
The families I work with when there's a sick kid, no matter what it is, I have yet to meet a parent who wouldn't just hand me their wallet and say, you fix him. And so, from that extent that, or the sense that life is priceless, I worry about the impact of that desperation, that need on how we price things. And given the evidence or lack thereof here, it's hard to know how to qualify that desperation in pricing.
Okay, Paul?
And then Alex, I'll make sure Alex gets a chance to talk too. The way I look at this is all therapies come in as low value until proven otherwise. And then they need to demonstrate that they are, at least something above that. So I don't have a problem voting something low value when there's huge uncertainty. And so in this case, I'm not going to vote low value, but I will say the uncertainty will worsen the value in my mind.
And I might encourage, for those of you who are, again, wrestling with this very core issue, obviously the cost effectiveness team tries to look at uncertainty in a variety of different ways, through univariate sensitivity analyses, through the probabilistic approach, through scenario analyses. So feel free to probe again about how far the attempts went to try to capture the uncertainty and what the impact was on the cost effectiveness threshold, because that's at least one way you can start to try to think about how to balance your concerns about uncertainty with the findings of the model, the base case. Alex?
Yeah. I found the modeling impressive, Melanie, and yet still I'm left with this fundamental concern that these estimates are drawn from such small groups of patients when we're extrapolating to long-term value. And even though you varied all of these different parameters, I cannot say with any degree of confidence that this is a high value in this case. And then particularly, the issue that Paul raised earlier about, I worry that I'm not positive that the right figure was used for overall survival. It looked much more like the figure for remission. I wonder if
that
you
was
could
the
address
progression, the event-free survival curve that was presented, so not overall survival.
It was event-free survival.
That on the graph, that wasn't, the intention of presenting that graph wasn't to show these are all the curves that we use. This was just to show, these curves are a little unique. We have this plateau and the tail, and so that was more as a, it was in the method section, not in our input section, as to show this is how we fit our curves for these, and had to make some adjustments based on some uniqueness as part of these these potentially curative therapies. So yeah, that was just one of the curves. Overall survival curve was our main driver of the model, and it did take longer to flatten.
Okay, Jeff.
Just to make sure I heard you right, you said the overall survival curve was the main driver. And was it you who was saying that maybe the survival parameters were kind of difficult to vary because there wasn't data to do that with?
Because of the single-arm trials, that's correct. And so that's why we tried to choose this relatively extreme example of using, not to be too economic-based, but kind of standard parametric techniques, and that's where that curve kept going down. And so that was our attempt of, 100% we aren't certain about this survival evidence. We have to account for this somehow. And so let's try to do this lower bound of survival that's expected and see what that outcome is. And so that's what that final scenario analysis tried to do, trying to be as creative as we possibly can to, inform what that lower bound could be.
Okay. Again, I'm somewhat sensitive to the time, so I am not seeing any other tent cards up. This is an important vote, but it's been a good discussion. So why don't we go ahead and vote either A, B, or C? One more. Has anybody not voted? Okay. So we have 2 people abstaining and 12 votes. Wow. All right, we will have to talk to the company, but the results show 1 low, 8 intermediate, and 3 high. All right. And again, we'll have to confirm the votes. Somehow the system is showing 14 instead of 12 people, instead of 13 people, unless we miscounted earlier. All right, let's keep going then. On now to the next patient population, where we've shifted away from the pediatric population to those ages 18 years and older with aggressive B-cell lymphoma, which is refractory or in second or greater relapse. So the first, as you know, the first question is going to be comparative clinical effectiveness. Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate a net health benefit for treatment with Yescarta versus treatment with the regimens assessed in the SCHOLAR-1 trial? Jeff, can you remind people why that's the comparison that's being asked here, and your brief summary of the key findings?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to find it here. There we go. So, first have you turn your attention to table 3.8, the benefits for Yescarta compared to the SCHOLAR-1 outcomes. The complete remission rates, the difference was 47% versus 7%, so a marked difference. We don't have a table for the overall survival at 6 months. It's in the report, and I presented that today. But as a reminder, it was 80% for the Yescarta trial and 55% for the SCHOLAR-1 trial, so a 35% difference. And then the other unique thing here is the investigators did do a comparative trial using something called propensity score weighting, which is one of the more sophisticated approaches to try and get around selection bias. Not perfect, no observational technique is perfect, but it's a way to try and do that. And they showed significant differences in remission rates and overall survival with that analysis, highly statistically significant and large clinical effects, which accounts more carefully for potential differences in the baseline characteristics of the patients in the ZUMA-1 trial compared to those in the SCHOLAR-1 trial. So those are the clinical benefits. The harms would be, I think, table D7, but you've heard a lot of testimony about the comparison of CAR T therapy to, in this case, truly chemoimmunotherapy, usually standard chemotherapeutic agents plus immune modulators, usually rituximab. So you really do get the full impact of chemotherapy in this case.
Okay, so we've shifted gears, shifted drugs, shifted patient populations. Thank you, Jeff, for that summary.
And of course, I should say, I meant to say it the last time and should highlight again this time, uncertainty, 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 as we've talked about. It just seems like such a theme. I don't feel like I need to, but we shouldn't forget about that. Single-arm trials, lots of problems, short follow-up, but we're extrapolating potentially over the long term for these. Right. Maybe less of an issue in an adult population, and they're average in the mid to late 50s. But.
Patient experts, real briefly, is this a game changer, home run, solid double? What is it?
So I think it's a game changer. I just want to make sure that people understand, and again, I'm a co-author on the NEJ study that used this SCHOLAR-1 as a reference point. SCHOLAR-1 is not a trial. It was a retrospective analysis of 3 different data sets to try to find a comparator that was comparable. So it's not comparison of one single-arm trial to another single-arm. That SCHOLAR-1 is not a trial. It's a retrospective group analysis of 3 separate data sets. So that said, I think it was trying to find a comparator for patients who historically would have done poorly, and it was used as a reference setting point for the prospective trial. I do think that the trial results are appropriately game-changing, but I think that wording it really needs to be considered. I think it's fair to say SCHOLAR-1 study, so I think you really shouldn't vote on it as a trial because that implies something that it's not.
Thank you, sorry, I misspoke. I agree 100%.
So noted. So in your vote, we'll consider this the Scholar 1 study, not trial. Do you all have any questions about the evidence and your way of thinking about it again? Again, usually it's a little bit easier the second time around in at least some ways. But I want to scan to see if anybody has any specific, especially if you're thinking of voting differently here than you did on the other drug. It might be helpful for you to share that thinking with others. You might get their input or change their thinking. Okay, I'm looking pretty satisfied. All right, why don't we go ahead and vote then? Is the evidence adequate to demonstrate a net health benefit for treatment with Yescarta versus treatment with the regimens assessed in the Scholar 1 study? $13, I'm going to assume that's how many we have. 11 yes and 2 no. Thank God the numbers lined up with what it said it was supposed to be. I'm going to quickly move on before something changes. All right. We have, let's see, why did that happen? Oh, I'm sorry. Because we're in the new patient context, we have 2 votes about the the new active treatments versus the ones assessed in the Scholar study. So the next question is about, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate a net health benefit for Kymriah versus treatment with the regimens that were assessed in the Scholar 1? Jeff, again?
Yeah, so here we're looking in terms of benefits at the table 3.9 in your essential tables. Complete remissions in the 2 trials of 40 to 57% for Kymriah, 7% again in the Scholar 1 study. We don't have a propensity score matched evaluation. We don't have overall survival data. The Juliet trial hasn't been published yet, so a little more uncertainty, but still a large magnitude of benefit. In terms of the harms, you have similar comparisons again, as we've heard from people with real clinical experience. Really seems to be qualitatively a different set. Certainly not worse harms with CAR T therapy. Again, we have uncertainties about the long-term harms, but likely small compared to the benefits.
Okay. Any questions about the data? Okay. Please go ahead and vote. Yes or no, A or B? Okay, 9 yes, 4 no. So noted. All right. The CTAF panel is aware that we often also ask a question about whether the evidence at this time is adequate to distinguish between the net health benefits of different active agents in a certain area. So here again, in this patient population, is the evidence adequate to distinguish between the net health benefits provided by Yescarta and Kymriah? Jeff?
Yeah, so no head-to-head trials. The complete remission rates were similar. We don't have overall survival to compare. The harms are similar, at least close enough where different patient populations, selection bias could explain the differences. So it really felt like the evidence was insufficient to distinguish between the 2 at this time.
Questions from the panel? No? Okay, I know you guys have looked at this before. So please go ahead and vote. Okay, everybody said no. Thank you. So now we will move on to the other benefits again for Yescarta in this patient population. So the list is the same: reduced complexity, health disparities, caregiver family burden, novel mechanism of approach, significant impact on return to work overall productivity. While you're just thinking about it for a second, I guess I'd invite either one of the clinical experts who care for this patient population. Do you see anything specifically different here about the other benefits than was raised in the discussion that we had earlier about Kymriah? Okay. Patients, anything you want to, I mean, it's, again, we kind of talked through this, so if you have anything different you want to add here, that's fine. Anything from the panel? Paul?
I mean, I think, oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Oh, just that given the older age, greater potential for return to work.
I would also point out that from a patient standpoint on A, the reduced complexity that will significantly improve outcomes. I felt like the CAR-T, maybe from a clinician standpoint, would be equally as hard or harder, but as a patient, it was probably easier than the RICE therapy or the Scholar one that I also participated in. So I was a lot, yeah, so that would be my comment there.
Okay.
Paul, Paul, you just made a comment. I just wanted to respond to it. So you talked about greater propensity to return to work because of the age population?
Well, in terms of projecting return to work, I guess the question is how many of these people would ever return to work? And
well, it's difficult because the median age of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma patients is no. It's
I thought this was 50s.
It's well into the 60s. So so and we're estimating conservatively probably 40-ish% would be Medicare age group. So it's just a complex question. I don't want to simplify it because there are plenty of people who are in their 40s who obviously would be likely to return to work, but there are others who are going to be retired at the time of diagnosis too. So it's not easy. I just didn't want to.
No, I assumed that there was a significant number of people still of working age getting the therapy. That was my assumption.
And there are, but it's a complicated issue because of the demographics of lymphoma patients in the older. Many are going to be at the time that they're at the end of their productive careers. That doesn't make it less meaningful.
Mel, we did a sensitivity analysis with productivity. What impact did it have on the ICERs? Do you know?
Yeah, our sensitivity analysis for the societal perspective, I think, is especially limited in this analysis. In our societal perspective we did in this evaluation, we were primarily focused on the productivity losses for treatment administration, what we called stage 1 of the model. So the time you would have to take off work to get the treatment, we did not have enough evidence to be able to figure out return back to work after the therapy. So in our societal perspective, because we were only including time lost from getting the treatment, and yes, Yescarta was inpatient administered, and Scholar 1 we assumed was outpatient administered, the ICER actually went up about 2,000 per quality when we were considering that. But huge caveat, our societal perspective is especially limited because there is not evidence here.
And the patients who were enrolled in Zuma 1 had almost no chance of being in a remission and returning to work because they had a dismal prognosis, right? I mean, historical, 10% chance or less of having a CR. So in a sense, again, the bar is very low with respect to return to work. So any successful therapy will, of course, lead to greater productivity because somebody's alive to be able to possibly return to work, even though the data, I think, with respect to those meaningful return to work, numbers are speculative.
Okay. Does anybody have another specific issue they'd like to raise? I'm not seeing any, so why don't we go ahead and finish the voting? Again, here I need you just to vote for all of these. Remember to look only up here at the slide when you're thinking about your votes, not at paper versions. So you should have A, B, C, D, or E. And I hope if you have an other that you raise it before we start the voting. Of course, I didn't give you that opportunity this time, but. Yes, Mike.
Steve, we're not going to vote on a question like this again, but return to work or return to kind of a normal productive life are equivalent in one way you could interpret this E question. If it's.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite.
I just want to reemphasize, it's not necessarily about going back to work if you're 58 or 60 years old. It's about doing what taking care of your grandkids or whatever. You don't have to go back to work. So it's about going back to whatever your normal activity is.
Specifically, this is meant to capture the actual impact on work because that can influence, depending on your perspective, what the findings of the cost effectiveness model are. So since our base case does not include that cost effect of going back to work, we specifically focus on that. The other piece is more linked to the general improvement in quality of life that should be factored into the QALY that's already there in the model. People will argue about whether it's adequately captured, but that's where that should be.
Thank you, that helps.
Sure. Okay, I hope, has everybody voted their full set on this? Anybody hasn't voted yet, completed? Okay. There we go. So 2 votes for A, 1 for B, 5 for C, 12 for D, 6 for E, and 1 for F. All right, so I just at least need to find out, did somebody vote F? All right, we'll continue to confirm after the meeting. All right, the last of these types of voting questions you'll all be really relieved to hear is upon us. It is about Yescarta and the contextual considerations. So are any of these important in assessing its long-term value for money? You've seen the same decisions set before, A, B, C, D, and E, so I won't read them again. I'm going to give you a few minutes to look at the questions, to look at the options here, and if you have any questions or strong feelings about them, particularly that would have been different here from Kim Raya, please bring them up. Okay, please complete your votes. Anybody still voting? Okay, I'll wait. Okay, anybody still voting? All right. So 11 for A, 1 for B. We can see the numbers there, 5, 11, 10, and the stubborn 1 for F. I think we have a gnome somewhere in the corner with a secret pad entering votes. Oh, did you vote?
Yep, same as with the first one, the cure issue.
Oh, the cure, okay. All right. We have a legitimate 1 for F there. Okay, we have the overall value vote now for Yescarta. So it says, given the available evidence on the 4 different pieces that we've talked about, comparative clinical effectiveness, incremental cost effectiveness, other benefits and contextual considerations, what's the long-term value for money of treatment with Yescarta versus treatment with the regimens assessed in the Scholar 1 study? Low, intermediate, or high? Mel?
So for this is the Yescarta versus chemotherapy in the B-cell lymphoma population. Our base case deterministic incremental cost effectiveness ratio is around 135,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. In a one-way sensitivity analysis, there were some parameters that when we were in with that plausible range, we increased above 175,000. Also pointing out in the one-way sensitivity analysis, we did remove the hospital markup and the ICER went down to around 110,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. The one-way and probabilistic sensitivity analysis, although our probabilistic sensitivity analysis had about 70% of our iterations being less than 150,000 per quality adjusted life year gained, that did not include the survival curve uncertainty. And so in our scenario analyses, we saw that the trial effect would need to extend to about 24 years to be able to find that cost-effective finding. And when we did the lower bound of survival scenario, we did see incremental cost effectiveness ratios in the 200,000s. But again, that should be interpreted as a lower bound for survival and kind of exploratory on our end.
So Mel, I do want to make sure that people understood a key piece of what you said, the 24-year horizon on this. So what that means is that if you assume that leveling off is less than 24 years long.
And the leveling off does account for all-cause mortality. So that's essentially saying that incremental difference that we're seeing between Yescarta and chemotherapy, that incremental difference would continue for 24 years. So we don't expect somebody to, not die at all for 24 years when this population is starting at a median older age. But we're seeing the incremental difference between Yescarta and chemotherapy, because we do allow for all-cause mortality.
Okay. So, Mr. Chair, Paul, you do cost effectiveness. You've seen this has a higher point estimate. It has the same cloud, if you will, of uncertainty. It's got a longer time horizon that would be required for it to meet the 150,000 threshold. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so again, for me, the uncertainty in the estimates makes the long-term value for money lower. And so let's say I accept that number and the model number is accurate. Again, but I might be tempted to call it intermediate. However, given the very large uncertainty, and that's acknowledged from the health system's perspective, I think I would call it a low value. I would interpret it as a low value for money, something that for which we maybe would demand a lower price until some of that, we had better data and some of that uncertainty was less.
Okay. Other perspectives or questions, either of Mel or others, each other? Okay, please go ahead and vote. A is low value, B is intermediate, or C is high. So we've got 2 people still voting, I hope.
I'm not voting for the same reason.
Oh, 2 people not voting? 2, okay, maybe the system is now, we have 2 abstentions. So we have 5 low, 5 intermediate, and 1 high. Okay. And I think those numbers may actually stick. So we will confirm all of the numbers. Please keep the notes that you guys take on your voting sheets, because that will help us confirm back with you, especially on the other benefits. I want to thank you for this process.